Imagine the most powerful man you can think of, arrogant, wealthy, the owner of everything money can buy, crossing paths with an ordinary, spirited woman whose greatest asset is her independence. Now picture their two opposite worlds colliding in one absurd and improbable accident. What begins as a clash quickly evolves into a relationship filled with humor, challenges, and an unexpected journey to discover what truly matters in life. But beware, not everything is as it seems, and the secrets and choices made in the heat of the moment may forever alter both their destinies. Follow along and find out who's really changing whom. Edward Blackwell drove with the kind of confidence that only comes from a life where everything, or nearly everything, always goes your way. The winding roads of the Cotswolds held no concern for him, and the rolling green hills and picturesque villages were little more than a backdrop to his thoughts. The purr of his Aston Martin's engine complemented the clipped tones of his assistant coming through the car's speaker system. "Mr. Blackwell," began the assistant, with the kind of hesitation that comes from knowing any suggestion to slow down would be met with disdain. "I've been reviewing the budget increases for the new project. It could affect profit margins." "Then cut the budget," Edward replied, his tone flat as he kept his eyes on the road. "With all due respect, sir, perhaps it's time to consider a more human approach." Edward raised an eyebrow, as if his assistant had suggested investing in flying pigs. "Human? I'll think about it. Right after humans start paying my bills." There was an awkward laugh on the other end of the line. Before the assistant could respond further, Edward cut the call and turned up the music, a classical piece perfectly curated to match the rhythm of his drive. "More humans. That's exactly what I need," he muttered, his Aston Martin eating up the road ahead. That was when he saw it, a herd of sheep crossing the narrow lane, herded lazily by a man who seemed entirely at peace with the world's slower pace. Edward groaned, easing the car to a crawl. "Brilliant. Even livestock are conspiring to ruin my day." As he glanced away briefly to mutter curses under his breath, he missed the figure walking along the roadside, balancing a box full of fresh fruit. When he turned his attention back, it was already too late. The screech of tires filled the air as Edward slammed on the brakes, but not quickly enough. The fruit went flying, apples and pears tumbling across the grass, and the figure fell to the ground. Edward leapt from the car, his heart pounding. He had never run anyone over before, not even figuratively, as he liked to think. Kneeling beside the fallen woman, he tried to keep his voice calm. "Are you all right?" he asked. The woman blinked up at him, her eyes narrowing slightly before a faint, wry smile appeared on her lips. "Well, considering I've just been hit by an Aston Martin, I'd say I'm doing as well as could be expected. At least it wasn't a Vauxhall." Edward stared, unsure whether to laugh or apologize again. "It was an accident. I didn't see you." "Obviously," she interrupted, wincing as she tried to sit up. "But honestly, I always assumed the rich trampled the poor metaphorically. This is a nice touch of realism." His mouth opened to respond, but her groan of pain stopped him. Without thinking, he scooped her up in his arms. She was light, but the weight of the situation pressed heavily on him. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice surprisingly steady for someone injured. "Taking you to the hospital. And if I'd rather die dramatically here, among the apples." "You'll have to schedule that for another day," Edward replied, setting her gently into the passenger seat of his car. As he sped toward the nearest hospital, she opened her eyes just enough to glance at the luxury interior. "If I ever have to be run over again, I hope it's by this car. Seems fitting." Edward almost smiled, but the guilt gnawed at him. "Just stay calm. You'll be fine. That's what rich people always say, usually right before they declare bankruptcy." Shaking his head, he focused on the road. She was either brave, stubborn, or completely mad, possibly all three. At the hospital, the medical staff rushed to her aid, leaving Edward in the waiting room, something he was unaccustomed to, waiting. Hours passed, but he couldn't stop replaying the accident in his mind, haunted by her sarcastic quips and unexpected resilience. When a nurse finally approached, Edward stood abruptly. "How is she? Will she be all right?" "She needs rest," the nurse said. "But she's conscious. You can see her for a few minutes. Just no stress." He entered the room cautiously. The young woman was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling. She turned her head as he entered, her expression calm but with a hint of humor. "Well, you survived," she said, her voice light. "I thought you might have run off." "I don't run," Edward replied, trying to sound serious. "Except from a sheep, apparently." Edward let out a short laugh despite himself. "The accident was my fault. I wasn't paying attention." "Relax," she said, waving a hand weakly. "It's the most exciting thing to happen to me in weeks." He studied her, unsure of what to say. Finally, he asked, "What's your name?" "Margaret Heath," she said. "But you can call me Maggie." "Edward Blackwell." "Ah, that sounds expensive," Maggie said, smirking faintly. Before he could reply, she raised an eyebrow. "Edward, can I ask you for something strange?" "That depends on how strange. If I don't survive, I want you to promise me something. Marry me. It'll be great. Everyone will laugh at my funeral." He blinked, stunned. "You're joking. I've never been more serious." "Well, maybe just a little." Edward crossed his arms, staring at her. "If it makes you feel better, fine. But for the record, this is the most absurd request I've ever received. And you're the strangest man I've ever met. Fair trade." When she closed her eyes again, a faint smile still lingered on her face. Edward remained by her bedside for a moment longer, wondering why he had agreed to such a ridiculous promise, and why, inexplicably, he felt like there was something about her he couldn't ignore. Edward Blackwell was not a man accustomed to physical challenges. He preferred financial battles, the kind resolved in conference rooms over expensive coffee and spreadsheets full of profits. And yet, here he was, standing in the middle of a field in the Cotswolds, staring at a cottage that looked like it belonged in a tourist brochure titled, "Charming and Uncomfortable Living." "Welcome to my palace," said Maggie, gesturing dramatically toward the small stone cottage with crooked windows and a moss-covered roof. "Notice the leaky ceiling and the million-dollar view. I'm practically the queen of simplicity." Edward crossed his arms, glancing at the dirt pathway leading up to the door. "The view might be worth $1 million, but the rest of it? Let's just say your assets need re-evaluation." "Oh, a tycoon who makes jokes," Maggie replied, picking up an empty bucket near the door. "We're making progress. Now come on. You're going to help." "Help? Me?" "Yes. Or do you think my vegetable garden takes care of itself?" Edward opened his mouth to protest, but Maggie was already limping toward the back of the house, her pace slower than usual due to her injury. He followed, feeling like a tourist lost in an unfamiliar country. Behind the house was a modest garden lined with rows of plants that all looked identical to him. "What is this?" "Potatoes, carrots, and what the neighbor optimistically calls zucchinis." "I'm not entirely sure he's serious." She set the bucket down and gave him a pointed look. "You can start by fetching water from the well over there. It's easy." Edward glanced at the stone well in the distance. "Why don't you have modern plumbing?" "Because life's more interesting with a well," Maggie said, grabbing a hoe and starting to dig around the plants. Reluctantly, Edward walked over to the well, grabbed the bucket, and began cranking the handle. After a few moments, he paused, turning to Maggie. "You know, when I need water, I usually just press a button. And that's why you're winded after a minute of work," she said, not looking up. Edward grumbled under his breath and continued. When he finally hauled up the full bucket, he discovered it was significantly heavier than it looked. He tried carrying it over to Maggie, but the water sloshed dangerously with every step. "Why is this so difficult?" he muttered. "Maybe because you're carrying it like someone who's never worked a day in his life," Maggie said, barely containing her laughter as she watched his awkward progress. He tripped over a rock and nearly spilled the entire bucket, but managed to make it to her, panting. "Here, your precious water. And you made it look so effortless," she teased, taking the bucket with a grin. "See? One day, you might even get promoted to manure duty." Edward narrowed his eyes at her, but despite himself, he couldn't help laughing. Something about this place, about her, was starting to loosen something in him he hadn't realized was so tightly wound. Later, as the sun began to set, they sat on the porch of her cottage. Maggie sipped tea from a chipped mug, while Edward tried to wipe the dirt off his hands with a handkerchief that was clearly not up to the task. "So, what do you think of my little world?" Maggie asked, gazing out at the horizon, where the sky was streaked with shades of orange and pink. "Chaotic, uncomfortable, and strangely relaxing," Edward admitted, surprising himself. "You're full of surprises," she said with a small smile. Edward was silent for a moment, taking in the stillness around them. "Do you live like this every day?" "Yes. Every day's a little adventure. Sometimes I trip over my optimistic zucchinis, and sometimes I have to chase off foxes with a saucepan. It's life." He laughed, but something in her answer made him think. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like he needed to be anywhere else, doing something more important. As night fell, stars began to appear in the sky, glittering brightly in the vast darkness. Maggie pointed up, her voice soft. "Look at that. That's my billion-star ceiling. Try topping that with your penthouses." Edward gazed up at the stars. For once, he didn't feel the need to top anything. He just sat there, watching, beside her. Edward knelt in the garden, staring at two nearly identical plants with the intensity of someone trying to solve a high-stakes puzzle. One was, apparently, a potato. The other, as far as Maggie was concerned, could only be classified as some kind of weed. "This is the potato," she said, pointing helpfully. "And that, well, that's something only a botanist could love. Want to give it another shot? Can I just admit that all plants look the same and call it a day?" "You could," Maggie replied, smirking as she adjusted her sun hat, "but I'd be disappointed. And that would be tragic, considering you're the richest person I know." Before Edward could deliver a sharp retort, the sound of a car engine interrupted them. It was distant at first, but growing louder, rumbling across the otherwise peaceful countryside. Maggie frowned, shielding her eyes as she turned toward the driveway. Edward, however, recognized the engine immediately. An expensive sports car pulled up, gleaming in the sunlight. The door opened, and out stepped Catherine Rowley, looking as polished as a diamond and just as cold. Her heels clicked against the gravel as she strode toward them, her expensive dress swaying with each determined step. "Edward," she said, her voice crisp and theatrical, "so this is where you've been hiding. I must say, I expected something more civilized." Maggie, still holding her hoe, tilted her head slightly, observing Catherine as though she were a rare bird. "Nice car. Is it for escaping farms or avoiding commitments?" Edward closed his eyes briefly, already bracing himself for the headache this was bound to cause. "Catherine, what are you doing here?" "I'm trying to understand why you've thrown everything away," Catherine replied, ignoring Maggie entirely. "Our life. Our plans. All of it. Just to be here." She gestured toward the cottage and garden as if pointing to a natural disaster. Maggie stepped forward, her expression calm but tinged with amusement. "No offense, but you sound like someone who's lost a very expensive dog." Catherine finally turned to Maggie, raising an impeccably groomed eyebrow. "And you are Maggie Heath, owner of this rustic masterpiece. And you must be the ex who thinks she's more important than she really is." Edward quickly stepped between them before the conversation spiraled out of control. "Catherine, this is Maggie. Maggie, this is Catherine. Now that introductions are over, how about we all take a deep breath?" Catherine showed no interest in breathing deeply. She stepped closer to Edward, her voice dropping into a mix of accusation and disbelief. "Edward, you had everything. Wealth, status, power, and you gave it all up to play farmer." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Catherine, maybe what I had wasn't everything I needed." "Oh, sure," she said with a sharp laugh. "You needed simplicity. Like that's going to fill the void of not being anyone." Maggie chuckled softly. "Funny. You seem full of money and completely empty at the same time." Catherine's eyes narrowed, but she dismissed Maggie with a glance and turned back to Edward. "You've lost your mind, Edward. This fantasy of yours? It's going to come crashing down, and when it does, you'll realize the mistake you've made." Edward exhaled deeply, finally finding the resolve to speak clearly. "The only mistake I made was thinking my old life was all there was. I'm not here because I'm lost, Catherine. I'm here because, for the first time, I feel like I'm actually living." Catherine blinked, caught off guard by the firmness in his voice. "You've lost everything," she said bitterly. "And when you realize it, I won't be there waiting." With that, she spun on her heel and marched back to her car. The engine roared as she sped off, leaving a cloud of dust in her wake. As the silence settled over the farm again, Maggie leaned casually on her hoe. She has impeccable timing. Almost makes me wish I had a little more patience. Edward laughed, shaking his head. Sorry about that. Catherine isn't exactly easy. Oh, I noticed, Maggie replied with a grin. But you seem to be learning quickly. For the first time, Edward felt entirely certain that he was exactly where he was meant to be. Edward sat on the porch of Maggie's cottage, watching the golden light of the late afternoon spread over the rolling fields. For the first time in years, his mind wasn't consumed by profits, deadlines, or meetings. The silence around him felt like a luxury he had never known how to appreciate. From the side of the house, Maggie appeared, carrying a basket filled with freshly picked herbs. She placed it on the ground and tilted her head, studying him with a curious expression. "You're quiet," she said. "Too quiet for someone who usually has an opinion about everything." Edward smiled faintly. "I'm just taking it all in. There isn't much silence in my life. At least, there wasn't." Maggie smirked. "And is the silence better than the noise?" He hesitated, turning his gaze toward her. "When I'm here, yes. It's different. I'm different." Her eyes narrowed, her expression teasing but thoughtful. "Careful, Edward. It starts with compliments about the silence, and before you know it, you'll be adopting chickens." Edward laughed, but there was something deeper in his smile. He stood up and walked toward her, his face suddenly serious. "Maggie," he began, his voice steady but soft, "you've changed something in me. Something I didn't even know needed changing." She raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "I hope it's for the better. I'd hate to be responsible for ruining a magnet." "Definitely for the better," Edward said with a small chuckle. "You've shown me that there's more to life than everything I've been chasing. And now, I know I don't want to lose it. I don't want to lose you." For a moment, Maggie said nothing, her usual quick wit replaced by quiet surprise. Edward took her hands in his, the light from the setting sun casting a warm glow over them. "I'm not saying this out of guilt or because of that ridiculous promise you wrangled out of me in the hospital," he continued. "I'm saying it because you're the most real person I've ever met. You're my home, Maggie." Her mouth opened slightly, as if she were about to say something, but she hesitated, visibly moved. Edward dropped to one knee, right there on the weathered wood of the porch. "Margaret Heath," he said, his voice filled with both strength and vulnerability. "Will you marry me? For real this time? Forever? No tricks, no jokes. Well, not right now." For a moment, she simply stared at him, her expression unreadable. Then, slowly, a smile began to spread across her face, wide and radiant. "I was beginning to think you'd never ask," she said, pulling him into a hug. Edward wrapped his arms around her, and for the first time in his life, he felt a peace he didn't know existed. This wasn't the deal-closing triumph he was used to, nor was it the hollow satisfaction of acquiring yet another possession. This was something else entirely, something real. Later, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with brilliant streaks of orange and purple, they sat together on the porch, laughing and talking about a future neither of them had expected. The stars began to twinkle above them, forming the billion-star ceiling Maggie always boasted about. And for the first time, Edward didn't feel the need to top it. He simply looked up, holding Maggie's hand, knowing he was exactly where he was meant to be.